Some moments change a career forever, and some moments reveal the truth about power. The courtroom in downtown Norfolk, Virginia felt unusually tense that morning, the kind of silence that hangs heavy in the air before something unexpected happens, and nearly every wooden bench was filled with people waiting to watch what they assumed would be a routine hearing. Officer Daniel Carter stood near the front with his arms folded across his uniform, the silver badge on his chest catching the fluorescent lights above, his posture stiff with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. Across the defense table stood Maya Brooks, a black woman in her early 30s wearing a simple dark jacket and calm expression, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if the entire scene unfolding around her was nothing more than background noise. From the outside, she looked like someone the system had already decided about, another defendant standing in a courtroom, another name on a docket. But if you looked closely, there was something different in the way she carried herself, something steady and controlled, like a person who had stood in far more intimidating places than this. Carter clearly didn't notice it. His voice carried across the room as he spoke to the prosecutor, loud enough for half the audience to hear, his tone dripping with irritation as he described the arrest from the night before, making it sound like a simple case of someone refusing to follow instructions during a late evening traffic stop. The judge, Eleanor Whitman, adjusted her glasses while reviewing the file in front of her, unaware that the quiet tension between the officer and the woman at the table was about to become the focus of the entire courtroom. A few spectators leaned forward, sensing the shift in energy the way people instinctively recognize when a conversation is about to turn into something much bigger. Carter stepped closer to the table, his boots echoing softly on the polished floor, his expression hard as he addressed Maya directly, clearly expecting the same nervous compliance he had probably seen countless times before. But Maya didn't look nervous. She didn't raise her voice or protest. She simply lifted her eyes and met his gaze with a calm that made a few people in the room exchange curious glances. It was the kind of calm you see in someone who knows something the rest of the room doesn't yet understand. The clerk stopped typing for a moment. A deputy near the door shifted his weight. Even Judge Whitman glanced up briefly, sensing the growing tension. Carter misread it entirely. To him, the silence looked like defiance, and the confidence in Maya's posture felt like a challenge to his authority. "You should have thought about this before you caused trouble," he said sharply, his voice carrying through the room. Maya didn't respond right away. Instead, she straightened slightly, her voice quiet but clear when she finally spoke. "Officer," she said, almost calmly enough to sound like a warning, "you really should think about what you're doing right now." A faint murmur rippled through the benches behind them. Carter frowned, clearly annoyed by the tone. He thought the moment belonged to him. What he didn't know, what no one in the room knew yet, was that within the next few minutes, the entire courtroom was about to learn exactly who Maya Brooks really was, and the badge he wore so proudly would suddenly feel a lot heavier than it did a moment ago. Officer Daniel Carter did not like the way Maya Brooks said those words. The calm in her voice sounded less like fear and more like certainty, and that irritated him in a way he could not quite explain. Inside the Norfolk courtroom, the air felt heavier now, the quiet conversations that had filled the benches a few minutes earlier fading into a tense silence. Judge Eleanor Whitman looked up from the paperwork on her desk, her eyes moving slowly between the officer and the woman standing at the defense table. She had seen thousands of hearings in this courtroom over the years, but something about this moment felt unusual, as if the balance of the room had shifted without anyone fully realizing why. Officer Carter cleared his throat and straightened his uniform, trying to reassert control of the situation. The silver badge on his chest reflected the bright courtroom lights as he spoke again, louder this time, explaining his version of the events from the night before. According to him, Maya Brooks had been uncooperative during a late evening stop on a quiet Norfolk street, refusing to answer questions and showing what he described as an attitude that made the situation unnecessarily complicated. His voice carried across the wooden benches where spectators listened carefully, some nodding, others quietly studying the woman at the table. Maya did not interrupt him. She did not roll her eyes or show frustration. Instead, she stood with the same composed posture she had held since the hearing began, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, her eyes focused forward. It was the kind of calm that seemed out of place in a courtroom where most defendants appeared anxious or defensive. Even the court clerk paused briefly while typing, glancing up at Maya, as if trying to understand what made her presence feel different. Officer Carter noticed the attention shifting away from him and toward her, and it made his tone sharper. He spoke about respect for law enforcement and about how situations could escalate when people refused to cooperate. His words echoed slightly in the tall room, bouncing off the polished wooden walls and the rows of benches. Maya listened quietly until he finished. Then she took a slow breath and finally spoke again, her voice steady enough that everyone in the room could hear every word clearly. She said that she had remained calm the entire time during the stop, and that she had simply asked a question about why she had been pulled over. She said it without anger, without accusation, almost as if she were explaining a simple fact. That answer caused a soft murmur among the spectators behind her. Judge Whitman lifted the small wooden gavel and tapped it once, restoring order while studying the file that had just been handed to her by the clerk. The judge's expression slowly shifted from routine focus to quiet curiosity as she flipped through several pages. Something in the document seemed to catch her attention. Meanwhile, Officer Carter crossed his arms again, convinced that the situation was still firmly under his control. What he could not see from where he stood was the line of text near the top of the page Judge Whitman had just opened, a line that listed Maya Brooks not as an ordinary defendant, but as a highly trained member of the United States Navy. And as the judge's eyes paused on that detail, the entire direction of the hearing was about to change in a way no one in that courtroom expected. Judge Eleanor Whitman did not speak immediately after noticing the line in the document. Instead, she leaned slightly back in her chair, reading the page again more slowly, as if confirming that she had not misunderstood what was written there. The courtroom remained quiet except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a hallway door closing somewhere outside. Officer Daniel Carter noticed the pause and assumed it meant the judge was carefully reviewing his report, which only reinforced his confidence. He stood a little taller near the prosecution table, his expression firm, convinced the hearing was moving exactly where he expected it to go. Across the room, Maya Brooks remained composed, her hands resting calmly against the polished wood surface of the defense table. She did not look toward the benches where people whispered softly to one another, and she did not look toward Carter either. Her focus remained steady on the judge, as though she already understood the significance of what Judge Whitman had just read. The judge turned another page slowly, her eyes scanning several additional lines before lifting her gaze toward Maya. For a moment it seemed as if she were about to ask a question, but instead she glanced toward the court clerk beside her. The clerk leaned slightly closer as the judge quietly indicated a specific section of the file. The clerk's eyebrows lifted almost immediately, and she looked up toward Maya with a brief expression of surprise before returning her attention to the paperwork. The small exchange did not go unnoticed by the spectators seated behind the railing. A few people leaned forward, sensing that the routine rhythm of the hearing had quietly shifted. Officer Carter cleared his throat again, hoping to redirect the focus back to the report he had delivered moments earlier. He spoke about procedure and professionalism, explaining that maintaining order during traffic stops was an important responsibility for every officer in the city. His voice was steady, but the atmosphere around him had changed in a subtle way he could not quite identify. Judge Whitman finally lifted her hand slightly, signaling for him to pause. The room fell silent once more. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the file again before speaking in a measured tone that carried clearly through the courtroom. She asked Maya Brooks to confirm her full name for the record. Maya answered without hesitation, her voice calm and even. The judge nodded slowly and continued reviewing the page in front of her, her expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. Officer Carter watched the exchange with growing impatience, still assuming the conversation would soon return to the details of the arrest. But the judge's attention remained fixed on the document. Another quiet moment passed, and then she asked a second question, this time requesting confirmation of Maya Brooks's current professional affiliation. That question caused a noticeable ripple among the spectators. It was not the kind of question typically asked during a routine municipal hearing. Maya paused for only a second before answering clearly that she served in the United States Navy. The words alone were enough to cause several people in the room to exchange curious glances. Yet Judge Whitman was still studying the file, and the line that had caught her attention earlier remained visible at the top of the page. identifying Maya Brooks not simply as a service member, but as a highly decorated member of one of the most elite units in the entire United States military. And as the judge prepared to read that line aloud, the confidence that had filled Officer Carter only moments earlier was about to face its first serious test. The silence that followed Maya Brooks's answer seemed to stretch across the entire courtroom like a held breath. Judge Eleanor Whitman looked down once more at the document in front of her, carefully tracing a single line with the tip of her pen, as if making absolutely certain that every word on the page was accurate. The spectators in the wooden benches behind the railing leaned forward almost in unison, sensing that something important was about to be said. Officer Daniel Carter shifted his weight slightly, the confident expression on his face beginning to fade into mild impatience. He had expected the hearing to move quickly toward confirming the charges from the previous night, yet the judge's attention remained fixed on the file instead of his report. The quiet tension in the room grew stronger with each passing second. Finally, Judge Whitman adjusted her glasses and spoke again, her voice calm, but noticeably more deliberate than before. She said that the court record indicated that Maya Brooks currently served as a chief petty officer in the United States Navy. A ripple of murmurs moved through the spectators, and the court clerk briefly paused her typing before continuing. Officer. Carter raised his eyebrows slightly, clearly surprised but still attempting to appear unaffected. Many people in Norfolk had connections to the Navy because the city sat near one of the largest naval bases in the world. Yet Judge Whitman had not finished reading. Her eyes returned to the document as she continued in the same measured tone, stating that the file also described Maya Brooks as a decorated member of a highly specialized naval operations unit. This time the murmurs were louder, and several people in the back rows exchanged looks of disbelief. The judge finally lifted her gaze and looked directly at Maya. She asked a simple question that carried a surprising weight in the quiet courtroom. She asked Maya Brooks to confirm whether the information listed in the file was accurate. Maya did not hesitate. She answered calmly that the record was correct. The room fell completely silent again, but the silence now felt very different from the one that had filled the courtroom earlier. Officer Carter stood still near the prosecution table, processing the words he had just heard. His earlier confidence had been built on the assumption that he fully understood the person standing across from him. Yet the details now being read in open court suggested a very different story. Judge Whitman slowly closed the folder halfway and rested her hands on the bench in front of her. Her expression was thoughtful rather than dramatic, but the shift in the courtroom atmosphere was unmistakable. She explained that the court would need to review additional information connected to the incident from the previous evening before continuing with the hearing. She then asked the bailiff whether security footage from the courthouse entrance and surrounding area had already been requested as part of the record. The bailiff nodded and quietly confirmed that the video files had arrived earlier that morning and were available for review if the court wished to examine them. That single confirmation caused another wave of whispers among the spectators. Officer Carter looked briefly toward the large monitor mounted along the side wall of the courtroom, then back toward the judge. For the first time since the hearing began, uncertainty began to replace the certainty he had carried into the room. Meanwhile, Maya Brooks remained exactly as she had been from the start, standing calmly beside the defense table with the same steady posture that had puzzled everyone earlier. The hearing had begun as a simple case in the eyes of many people in that room. But as Judge Whitman prepared to request that the footage be played for the record, it was becoming clear that the story behind the previous night's encounter was far more complicated than anyone had first believed. The faint hum of the courtroom monitor filled the silence as the bailiff walked toward the equipment mounted along the wall, the soft echo of his shoes crossing the polished floor drawing every eye in the room toward the screen. Judge Eleanor Whitman rested her hands calmly on the bench, watching with the composed patience of someone who had learned that the truth often appeared only when people stopped talking and started observing. The spectators leaned forward slightly as the screen flickered to life, casting a pale glow across the wooden walls of the Norfolk courtroom. Officer Daniel Carter kept his arms folded across his chest, though the confident posture he had displayed earlier now looked more rigid than relaxed. He had spent years wearing that uniform, years believing that his version of events would naturally carry weight inside a courtroom like this one. Yet the presence of the video footage introduced a variable he had not fully anticipated. Across the room, Maya Brooks remained steady beside the defense table, her calm expression unchanged as the first image appeared on the monitor. The footage showed the courthouse entrance from the previous evening, recorded by a fixed security camera positioned above the wide glass doors. The image was clear enough for everyone to recognize the people entering and leaving the building under the bright exterior lights. The clerk paused her typing again as the recording began to play, and a quiet wave of whispers moved through the spectators as they realized they were about to witness the moment that had led to the hearing. The video showed Maya Brooks walking toward the entrance with an unhurried pace, dressed in simple civilian clothing, carrying herself with the same composed posture she now displayed inside the courtroom. A few seconds later, another figure appeared on the screen, approaching from the side of the frame. The uniform was unmistakable. Officer Daniel Carter stepped into view, speaking to her as she reached the doors. Because the camera did not record sound, the courtroom audience could only watch the body language unfolding on the screen. Judge Whitman observed closely, her expression neutral as the scene continued. Carter appeared to ask a question. Maya responded briefly, her posture calm, her movements controlled. The exchange lasted only a few seconds before Carter gestured toward the parking area outside the camera's view, apparently continuing the conversation. What happened next caused several spectators to shift in their seats. The footage showed Maya remaining composed while Carter's gestures grew noticeably sharper, his movements more animated as the conversation continued. The judge leaned forward slightly, studying the screen with greater focus. In the silent video, it was clear that Maya Brooks had not raised her voice or made any aggressive movement. She simply stood there, answering calmly while Carter continued speaking. The clip ended after less than a minute, freezing on the final frame of the two figures standing beneath the bright lights outside the courthouse entrance. A low murmur spread across the benches. Judge Whitman turned her gaze away from the screen and looked toward Officer Carter. For the first time since the hearing began, the story described in his report did not appear to match what the courtroom had just seen with their own eyes. Meanwhile, Maya Brooks remained exactly where she had been from the start, composed and patient, as if she had known all along that the truth would eventually reach the surface. And as the judge prepared to request the next section of footage, it was becoming increasingly clear that the simple narrative presented earlier that morning was beginning to unravel piece by piece. The frozen frame on the courtroom monitor lingered for a moment before the bailiff pressed a key and the video continued, the faint glow of the screen reflecting across the polished wooden surfaces of the room. Every person inside the Norfolk courtroom seemed focused on the footage now, because what had once sounded like a routine report was slowly transforming into something far more complicated. Judge Eleanor Whitman leaned slightly forward in her chair, her attention steady and patient, as the next segment of the recording appeared. The angle shifted to a second security camera mounted higher along the exterior wall, capturing a wider view of the courthouse entrance and the nearby sidewalk illuminated by tall overhead lights. The figures of Maya Brooks and Officer Daniel Carter stood clearly within the frame, their conversation continuing in silence without recorded audio. Carter appeared to be speaking firmly, his gestures becoming sharper as he pointed briefly toward the street, as if emphasizing a point. Maya remained still, listening and responding with calm movements of her hands, her posture straight and controlled. The spectators in the benches exchanged quiet looks with one another as the difference between the two individuals became more obvious. One looked increasingly frustrated while the other remained composed. The judge observed carefully, her eyes moving between the screen and the officers standing near the prosecution table. Officer Carter tried to maintain a neutral expression, but the tension in his shoulders suggested he understood that the video was beginning to shift the narrative away from the one he had described earlier. The recording continued for another 30 seconds. In the silent scene, Maya appeared to speak briefly before taking a small step back, giving the officer space while still maintaining eye contact. There was no sudden movement, no sign of aggression, only a controlled exchange that looked very different from the description that had filled Carter's written report. The courtroom remained quiet except for the soft sound of the video playing. The clerk stopped typing entirely now, watching along with everyone else. Judge Whitman raised a hand slightly, and the bailiff paused the video again, leaving the image of the two figures standing beneath the bright courthouse lights frozen on the screen. The judge looked toward Officer Carter and spoke calmly, asking him if the footage shown so far accurately represented the beginning of the encounter. Carter hesitated for the briefest moment before answering that it appeared to be the correct recording. His voice sounded steady, but the confidence from earlier in the morning had clearly faded. The judge nodded slowly and returned her attention to the screen. She explained that the court would continue reviewing the remaining footage before making any determinations about the events of the previous evening. Meanwhile, Maya Brooks stood quietly beside the defense table, her calm presence unchanged despite the growing tension surrounding the hearing. For her, the video did not seem surprising at all. It simply showed what had actually happened. But for Officer Carter, every additional second of footage carried the risk of revealing details that could no longer be controlled by words alone. And as the bailiff prepared to play the next segment, the quiet realization began to spread through the courtroom that the most important part of the story had not yet appeared on the screen. The screen in the courtroom flickered again as the bailiff resumed the recording, and this time the camera angle shifted to a third view position near the edge of the courthouse parking lot, capturing a wider section of the sidewalk and the row of parked vehicles along the street. The lighting from the tall metal lamp posts cast long shadows across the pavement, and the figures of Maya Brooks and Officer Daniel Carter were clearly visible near the entrance doors. Inside the courtroom, the spectators watched closely, their earlier whispers replaced by a deep silence that filled every corner of the room. Judge Eleanor Whitman rested her hands lightly on the bench as she observed the video with careful attention, the faint glow of the monitor reflecting in her glasses. Officer Carter stood still near the prosecution table, his arms no longer folded quite as tightly as before, his focus fixed on the moving images that now carried more weight than any statement he had given earlier. On the screen, Carter appeared to continue speaking firmly, gesturing toward the street while Maya remained calm, listening without raising her voice or stepping closer. A few seconds later, another person briefly entered the frame from the far side of the sidewalk, a passerby walking past the courthouse entrance. The individual slowed slightly, glancing toward the conversation before continuing down the block. That small detail did not go unnoticed by the people watching inside the courtroom. It suggested that the exchange had happened in clear public view, under bright lights, and within sight of multiple cameras. Judge Whitman leaned forward a fraction more as the video continued. The next moment showed Maya lifting one hand slowly, not in protest, but in what looked like a measured attempt to explain something. Her posture remained balanced and controlled, the same steady composure she had shown since the hearing began earlier that morning. Carter responded with another series of animated gestures, though the footage still revealed no sign that Maya had made any threatening movement. The difference between the two individuals was becoming increasingly visible even without sound. One appeared calm and focused while the other seemed more agitated with each passing second. The courtroom audience noticed it too. Several people shifted quietly in their seats as they watched the scene unfold on the screen. The clerk, who had returned to typing only moments earlier, slowed her hands again as the moment on the monitor seemed to reach an important turning point. Judge Whitman raised her hand slightly once more, signaling for the bailiff to pause the footage again. The screen froze on a frame showing Maya standing still while Officer Carter faced her with his shoulders angled forward. The judge turned her attention away from the monitor and looked toward Carter with a calm but serious expression. She asked him whether this portion of the video matched the sequence of events he had described in his written report. The question hung in the air for a moment, and the quiet tension in the room became almost tangible. Carter answered that the encounter had continued beyond what the court had just seen. His voice remained controlled, yet it carried a note of uncertainty that had not been there earlier. Judge Whitman nodded slowly and indicated that the court would now review the next segment of the recording. As the bailiff prepared to continue the footage once more, it was clear to everyone in the room that the moment approaching on that screen would likely determine how the entire story would be understood. The courtroom monitor came to life again as the bailiff resumed the final portion of the recording, and the quiet tension inside the Norfolk courtroom seemed to tighten like a held breath. Judge Eleanor Whitman watched the screen without speaking, her attention steady as the footage continued from the same wide angle near the courthouse parking lot. Under the bright overhead lights, Maya Brooks and Officer Daniel Carter were still standing several feet apart on the sidewalk, the calm night scene captured clearly by the security camera. Inside the courtroom, every spectator leaned forward slightly, aware that the moment about to unfold on the screen was likely the one that had led to everything happening in the courtroom that morning. On the video, Carter stepped closer while continuing to speak, his gestures sharp and impatient as he pointed briefly toward the street again. Maya remained composed, her shoulders relaxed and her posture balanced as she appeared to respond calmly. Even without sound, it was clear she was not raising her voice. Instead, she seemed to be explaining something while keeping her distance. The difference between the two individuals had become impossible to ignore. Carter's movements were tense while Maya's remained measured and controlled. A few seconds later, the footage showed Maya lifting her hands slowly in a neutral, non-threatening gesture, as if emphasizing that she was not trying to create a problem. The camera captured the moment clearly beneath the bright courthouse lights. Judge Whitman leaned slightly forward as the scene continued, studying every detail with the quiet focus of someone determined to understand exactly what had happened. The next moment on the screen caused several people in the courtroom to exchange surprised glances. Instead of escalating the situation, Maya simply stepped back another foot, creating more space between herself and the officer. Her movements were careful and deliberate, the kind of restraint that suggested training and discipline. The clerk stopped typing completely now, watching the monitor with the rest of the room. Officer Carter, standing near the prosecution table, kept his eyes fixed on the footage as the final seconds of the clip played. On the screen, he appeared to speak again, though the video showed Maya responding with the same calm composure she had maintained from the beginning of the interaction. Then the recording ended. The screen froze on the image of the two figures standing beneath the tall lights outside the courthouse entrance, the quiet sidewalk stretching behind them into the Norfolk night. For a moment, no one in the courtroom spoke. The silence felt heavier than before because the footage had answered many of the questions raised earlier in the hearing. Judge Whitman slowly looked away from the monitor and toward Officer Carter, her expression thoughtful but unmistakably serious. The version of events described earlier that morning no longer seemed consistent with what the courtroom had just observed. Meanwhile, Maya Brooks remained beside the defense table with the same calm presence she had carried throughout the hearing, her composure unchanged even as the entire room processed what the video had revealed. Judge Whitman finally reached for the small wooden gavel resting on the bench, preparing to address the courtroom and determine what the next step in the proceedings would be now that the evidence had spoken more clearly than any report or accusation ever could. Judge Eleanor Whitman allowed the silence in the courtroom to linger for several seconds after the video ended, giving everyone present a moment to absorb what they had just witnessed. The faint glow of the paused monitor still illuminated the wall, showing the final frozen image of the quiet sidewalk outside the courthouse where Maya Brooks and Officer Daniel Carter had stood the previous evening. Slowly, the judge reached for the small wooden gavel resting on the bench in front of her and tapped it once, the clear sound echoing softly across the Norfolk courtroom and bringing every whisper to an immediate stop. She folded her hands calmly and looked toward Officer Carter with the composed focus of someone who understood that the facts presented in court carried more weight than any assumption or accusation. In a steady voice, she explained that the court had now reviewed the available footage connected to the encounter described in the report, and that the images shown raised important questions about the accuracy of the initial account. The spectators seated behind the railing listened carefully, many of them still glancing at the screen where the final frame remained visible. Carter stood near the prosecution table, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet stillness as he listened to the judge's words. For the first time since the hearing began that morning, he did not attempt to interrupt or clarify. Judge Whitman continued by stating that the role of the court was not to rush toward conclusions, but to ensure that every decision rested on clear and verifiable information. She explained that based on the footage reviewed and the details contained within the official file, the court would require additional internal review from the appropriate department before proceeding with any further action related to the accusation presented earlier. A low murmur moved through the spectators as the meaning of her statement became clear. The narrative that had started the hearing no longer appeared certain. Meanwhile, Maya Brooks remained standing quietly beside the defense table, her posture unchanged and her expression calm as she listened to the judge. She had not raised her voice during the hearing, and she had not reacted emotionally to the tension that filled the room. Instead, she had allowed the truth to reveal itself step by step. Judge Whitman then turned briefly toward Maya and acknowledged her service record as it appeared in the court file, noting that individuals who served the country in demanding roles often carried a level of discipline that was evident in the way they handled difficult situations. The recognition was delivered in a neutral tone, yet it carried a sense of respect that had not been present when the hearing first began. The judge then looked back toward Officer Carter and reminded the courtroom that authority carried responsibility, especially when exercised in public view. Another quiet tap of the gavel followed as she concluded that the matter would move forward only after the additional review had been completed. The sound echoed once more through the room before fading into silence. As people slowly began to rise from the benches, the frozen image on the screen still showed the calm figure of Maya Brooks beneath the bright courthouse lights from the night before. And for many in the courtroom, the lesson of the morning had become unmistakably clear. A badge might symbolize authority, but truth had a way of revealing itself when patience allowed the full story to be seen.